Thank you for joining me today to discuss how we're going to leverage cognitive biases to accelerate our zero trust adoption. This is an interesting take that I found to be effective in advancing zero trust principles and overcoming some of that passive and active resistance that you may find yourself facing in organizations. Dive in, give you a little bit of background about myself and my experiences, not only with zero trust, but with behavioral economics and how I've leveraged these concepts. So my name is Rob LeMagna-Reiter. Currently, I'm the Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer at Woodman Life in Omaha, Nebraska. I've been in information security, for 19 or 20 years, half of that in various leadership roles in different verticals. Participate with several advisory committees, participate with the Cloud Security Alliance, Team 8, and above all else, I've mentored, advised, and guided several security programs and have helped transform how we think about control structures and evangelizing zero trust principles and where that makes sense on a maturity model and actually tracking progress. So I'm excited to jump in and walk you through some tools and capabilities that you might have not been exposed to before, and how we're going to try to make advances that both simplify day-to-day operations as well as fulfill our responsibilities as risk management practitioners. As with all topics that you might have not seen before, we're gonna dive into actually the parent topic, and that's behavioral economics. And at the highest sense, that is a field that combines both insights from psychology and traditional economics to better understand how people actually make decisions, right? Diverging from those rational models in traditional economics. So rather than assuming that individuals will always make logical choices that maximize self-interest, behavioral economics, on the other hand, recognizes that people, processes, organizations, they're all influenced by things such as cognitive biases, emotions, social factors, and mental shortcuts known as heuristics. So, for example, behavioral economics examines why people tend to value immediate rewards over future benefits, something known as present bias, why we overreact to potential losses, even when you're comparing to equivalent gains, such as that's known as loss aversion, and how they're influenced by how choices are framed or positions, which not ironically is called the framing effect. So these insights can help explain real world behaviors like spending, saving, health, and even information security, showing how decisions are less about maximizing values and more about managing perception, habit, and context. So we can use these to design better policies, products, environments, and et cetera, that guide our fellow practitioners to make more beneficial choices. So we're going to learn how to use these principles to nudge folks in the trajectory to adopting zero trust principles and changing control structures, because that's what it's all about. And we want to do that by really altering human behavior, because it's really complex and nuanced, shaped by both rational and irrational behavior. And so diving into cognitive biases, they're essentially mental shortcuts, right? Our brains process information very quickly, often at the expense of accuracy. And we're all pressed for time every day, right? So we rely on what we know best, what we found to work, to jump to the end and sometimes make a decision before we have all of the information. So these biases, they influence, right, how we perceive, interpret, and act on information, often without us even realizing it. So for instances, biases that we're going to talk about today, one is called anchoring, right? Anchoring causes us to rely too heavily on the first information that we see, affecting subsequent judgments. Availability heuristic leads us to estimate the likelihood that events on how easily examples come to mind, and that may not reflect reality. And then another one, known as representativeness heuristic, makes us judge likelihood based on how much something fits a pre-existing stereotype and things that we're all exposed to as we're going through our work, our job, even as we grew up. And so bringing that back to cybersecurity, these biases can skew things like threat perception, decision-making, and results in misjudging risk or overlooked areas of opportunity. So recognizing these biases helps us in counteracting their influence and making more rational, data-driven decisions, which is how we're able to better articulate the benefits of zero trust. So we're going to dive into some examples so that we're grounded in what we're talking about to overcome them, right? So the first being anchoring bias. An everyday example might be if someone sees a sweater or a piece of clothing that they're shopping for, and it's priced at $300, but it might be on sale for $100 or $150. Gosh, you may go, wow, that's a fantastic deal, because that anchor, that $300 is set. Even if $100, $150 is extremely pricey, you believe it's a good deal because you're anchored that you're getting a large deal. In information security, sometimes we assume that a threat might be assessed as high, and that can be set as an anchor, impacting downstream decision-making. Under the availability heuristic, an everyday example might be after watching news stories about an accident, such as an airplane crash. We might overestimate the risk of flying compared to driving, even though we all know flying is much safer than driving. In security, if we are recently attacked, or we have an inbox that was compromised as a result of a phishing attack, we may become overly focused on only preventing phishing as an overreaction, because that is the most recent example that we've been exposed to, skewing our overall risk assessment. And within the representativeness heuristic, an everyday example might be something like someone, supposedly you have someone who's quiet, analytical, detail-oriented. You might assume that that person's an engineer in security versus a salesman or somebody in marketing, because that fits the stereotype of an engineer, even though sales roles are just as common. And in security, this cognitive bias is typically seen when someone clicks on a suspicious link, maybe has a role in HR or some other role in the organization. We might perceive that as less risky than someone in IT who might have administrative access. This might skew how we implement controls, even though phishing impacts all roles in an organization. So as you can see, these are just very basic examples that they impact decision-making throughout the organization. So recognizing these is critical for successfully adopting zero trust, because they influence every decision we make about security, risk. And when you take into the fact that zero trust requires that never trust, always verify approach, meaning you have to base your access, authentication, and security decisions based on verified data or trust, right? With behaviors that align to policies on using the Kipling method, not on assumptions or past behaviors. So zero trust adoption demands recognizing that these biases be known, and we take these into consideration when we're communicating to the organization to avoid skewing judgment and misplacing priorities. By identifying and countering these mental shortcuts, we're going to build a culture based on trusting decisions and verified information over hunches, trying to minimize the likelihood of errors and biases. So anchoring in security can help lead to inaccurate assessments. So the initial information being outdated, misleading, or incorrect, it can distort our understanding of the true situation. So for example, if a security threat is initially assessed as moderate, as we talked about earlier, but later shows signs of being severe, decision makers may still underestimate the risk due to the anchor. So perpetuating biases and misjudgments is another area in danger of anchoring. It reinforces pre-existing beliefs or assumptions, making it harder to pivot to a new objective when even new evidence emerges. So with the implications of zero trust, we all are aware of traditional security frameworks and paradigms. So even when new evidence has emerged that there's a new way of controlling risk and validating information organization under a zero trust principle, lots of organizations, brilliant individuals are anchored in beliefs and control structures of the past, and that skews the how high their walls are in trying to embrace a new paradigm of protecting and controlling information within the organization. So the anchoring bias narrows our perspective, it limits flexibility, and it prevents decisions from being as adaptive or creative as they need to be. So being able to recognize that and understand that that's how folks are approaching you versus just saying no or being shut down to something like zero trust is essential to making informed, responsive choices in a high stakes environment like security. Another great example of anchoring in action is this picture that I frequently bring up to different engineering teams or different business units, and that we are so set in our ways if something is working that it can be hard to take a step back, bring our heads up, and look at a better way of accomplishing our goals. In information security, that's frequently looking at traditional control processes, perimeter protections, traditional frameworks that have outdated, ineffective controls based on trying to limit access versus just right size that access for the right role, the right user at the right time for the right need, such as Zero Trust advocates for. So when there's a new and interesting way of doing things like Zero Trust, it's on us. It's our responsibility to showcase those that are in motion, that have timeliness tasks and that have deadlines, that there can be a better way of doing things and using examples, not just forcing something across the finish line because it sounds great and has a lot of adoption and a lot of momentum. Jumping forward to the availability heuristic, it poses risks by causing us to judge or misjudge the likelihood or importance of events on how easily they come to mind, right? Based rather than objective data. So that can lead to several dangerous outcomes with some implications for Zero Trust. So again, skewing the risk perception and being very proactive versus proactive. How I've mainly framed Zero Trust in a lot of the organizations that I've overhauled programs is very simply telling them we're going to take a reactive program and start tweaking different controls and different disciplines within that program structure and flipping them to be more proactive. So we need to have responses that are not reactive to recent events, rather fostering that proactive, balanced approach to security. You got to stop focusing on the crisis of the moment and building towards controlling the controllables so that you can focus your time and energy in the right areas. And that's what Zero Trust enables you to do by controlling the controllables, focusing less so much on what your ever-expanding attack surface is, more narrowly looking at what your protect surface is, because you can identify, code, and implement those controls in data streams and business processes, further enabling you to be very proactive and taking a stance that you know that even though you're constantly being attacked, right, or organizations are constantly being breached, or our employees are being tricked, your blast radius or the impact is much more muted because you are being proactive in how you're doing your policy administration approach. This also gives you a false sense of security or overconfidence. That availability heuristic might tell you that if you've had no high-profile incidents or if things have been quiet, you may mistakenly assume that you're well protected or that you don't need to make a change. Why fix what's not broken, you might hear someone say. That out of sight, out of mind approach can also leave you vulnerable to maybe less publicized threats. It can allow folks to jump into silos and be contained within silos a little too much. We need to make sure that we don't misalign those security priorities. We don't want to focus on immediate fixes and celebrating elusive wins that don't actually move the needle forward. That long-term fix to proactive security supported by Zero Trust is one of the areas that we need to continue to change the thinking paradigm and alter how we talk about Zero Trust. You can actually advance Zero Trust in a lot of organizations without even using that term. By reframing it as something as going from reactive to proactive, you're assigning a negative connotation to existing programs and practices and a positive connotation to something like Zero Trust without even saying it, and you're accomplishing the same goal. Jumping into representativeness heuristic, which a simple way to think about this is misjudging risk. You're overlooking real risk indicators. Think of it as we rely on stereotypes to assess risks. So you might ignore a critical indicator that doesn't fit assumptions or fit what you know to be true or fit with your lived experience. So if you assume that an attack or a threat is mostly external, you might misinterpret an insider threat, misinterpret an innocent insider threat, or a mistake internal to your organization, which can be equally or more damaging, which is why it's so important to focus on that protect surface and lock down business process controls based on Zero Trust principles. You can also underestimate vulnerabilities, and that can be informed by biased decision-making. So by relying on typical profiles, you may overlook threats in unexpected areas. So a good example of this in organizations is assuming that only technical individuals are likely to introduce a security risk, where in fact, everyone in the organization, can be HR, sales, marketing, are most and often commonly targeted by attackers. It's not only those with administrative privileges. You start looking about biased assumptions about people, about teams, about technologies, leading to decisions that lack nuance. So if a leader assumes that certain departments are inherently more secure, so if you think that your security team or your IT teams or your engineering teams are inherently more secure, they actually may allocate fewer resources to essential training or safeguards in those areas, increasing your risk exposure, right? So you're misjudging risk because just because I'm running an information security team or program does not inherently mean that we're de facto more secure than any other group. You have to place the same level of importance on the control structure, aligning your business processes. Within security, you have to do other departments because it's all based on the information and the data. We're just responsible for being the stewards of conveying the importance of changing how we apply those controls and risks. And so, again, falling into this cognitive bias helps give us a false sense of control. Again, when you're very familiar, very experienced, you have seen a lot, but not all patterns are familiar that fall into what your lived experiences are. We fall into the misnotion of complacency, where safeguards could be ignored because they don't fall into that traditional risk sense. So again, it's all about recognizing these dangers. And these are things that we take for granted, that go from day to day, week to week, and they just happen because they're an innate part of who we are and how teams and organizations are structured. It's only by recognizing some of these cognitive biases that you can put the pieces together that, wow, that's not passive or active resistance against my evangelism or the buy-in to zero trust. It's ingrained biases to how we perceive and operate in all things. It just happens to manifest itself in your jobs, but it actually manifests itself in all notions and ways of life. But I'm happy to tell you that we can leverage all of these biases and some of the lessons in behavioral economics to cross over and escape Groundhog Day, right? Escape the insanity, jump to the other side of the rainbow. And there's a much better world out there. And you have to do that and eliminate bias by recognizing it and eliminating it by trying to focus and push more to data-driven decision-making. So what does data-driven decision-making actually mean? One, you have to increase awareness that biases exist. So you have to educate teams on common biases, such as the anchoring availability and so on that we talked about earlier today. Awareness is the first step. Admitting that we, organizations, and society and teams at large, we're all biased. So how do we recognize that and apply that to making better decisions going forward? Once we've acknowledged and increased awareness and education and coaching, you need to define clear and objective metrics. So you need to establish the specific measurable metrics that reflect on the actual performance, risk, or value that are currently in place and what we're trying to achieve through zero trust adoption, right? There's various tools and material out there, such as calculating value for both small to medium businesses, large businesses, and moving up a maturity model within zero trust to gauge the effectiveness on how we're going from present state to future state. You need to implement data collection and analysis capabilities. So whether it's existing tools and processes that a team have or iterations that you need to make on top of that, be able to gather, analyze, and interpret data correctly. So you might already have something deployed that's monitoring network activity, detecting anomalies, assessing vulnerabilities. You should be able to use this data to tell a story and to retweak that story as you're embarking on your zero trust journey. And then going forward, taking a standardized decision-making process, encouraging your teams to establish and push forward hypothesis testing and regular reviews. So we go into changing a control structure, maybe on a new application, a new service, a new business unit, and we're testing the waters by creating zero trust policy or heightened segmentation. we should have several hypotheses with expected outcomes because we're dipping our toes and you got to start small, start somewhere, and then you can snowball your momentum and progress as you take those lessons learned and put that into that feedback cycle, which goes into the last point is you need to continuously train and adapt. As data grows and evolves, as you learn more from your experimentation, your decision-making processes should evolve either. So as you're pushing out zero trust policy and decision-making to other business units, to other control structures, you're going to be aware of the bias going in. You're going to know quickly how to construct and implement that policy. You're going to stub your toes fewer times. And those frameworks are being based on continuously updated information, which allows you to be objective and responsive. So by embedding these steps into your decision-making process, you can move away from a lot of the bias-driven choices and adopt a data-driven decision-making process. I'd like to take a break and acknowledge that we've known this for a long time, right? Bruce Schneier famously said once that technology actually can't solve your security problems. And if you think it can, you don't understand the problems and you don't understand the technology. It all goes back to standard work and standard process. So how can we reset anchoring and reset and overcome some of the biases to propel zero trust adoption? We're going to be using evidence-based risk assessment frameworks. You could use something like NIST or ISO, CIS, grounding those assessments and frameworks, but pairing it with a maturity model to zero trust guidelines and roadmaps helps leverage what you know and advance under the zero trust principles. Having a working group that has regular checkpoints and updates that you can adopt and evangelize a culture of flexibility and decision-making. Both leadership and team members down to individual contributors need to view the security plans as both adaptable and flexible, as opposed to fixed, as opposed to a rigid structure. By framing security as a dynamic area that responds to both threats and better processes and ways of accomplishing how we manage cyber risk, that is easier to gain buy-in for reassessing and adjusting our priorities. And that is what our team members throughout an organization need to hear in order to embark and partner with us on a zero trust journey. I will say, though, adapting and changing, that's not a sign of error. That's actually a sign of resilience, as the threat actors are also constantly changing. Importantly, is just as importantly as implementing regular checkups, check-ins, maintaining a culture of flexibility. You also need to document these decisions along with the rationale, the follow-up, who's going to be responsible, who's going to be accountable. That helps encourage diverse input, allows you to bring in some independence and some analysis from other teams. And above all else, it translates into transparent communication. So by communicating the data, by communicating who's supporting it, by communicating where we're starting to evangelize and push out our zero trust working norms and principles, that becomes a proactive approach, data-driven approach where you can align and see your changes as necessary, aligned to strategic outcomes with the organization. And the more you push these into daily routines, you can break free from the anchoring bias while being aligned with organizational goals. Diving into how you can correct risk perceptions, right, to overcome availability, heuristic, for example. This is very similar, but a little bit of a different take on. We need to start with developing a comprehensive risk profile. A lot of organizations already have a semblance of that, whether it's formal or informal. But you need to frame the options in a more positive manner. It's not that we're reducing risk by X%, right? It's that we're accelerating organizational velocity by X or YZ%, or that we're able to take more measured risks or strategic bets because we've enhanced our cyber resilience. We're operating under a more resilient, more flexible security structure powered and enforced by zero trust principles that allows us to move quicker, faster, and gain a competitive edge. You need to dive in and understand where this may align in your organizations. This also helps you tell the story of how business aligned security is versus just being a cost center. We also talked about consistent security metrics. If you're not working on what those should be, and how they tell a great story, that should be a key part of how you're showing the old world from a reactive security program to the new world of a proactive security program. It's not just identifying and fixing vulnerabilities. It's about how quickly we're overcoming changes within an initiative, how fast we're able to execute the appropriate rights and onboarding of maybe a contractor or executing on a statement of work from marketing, enabling software engineering to test the latest and greatest tools without increasing your risk exposure, enabling the business to move faster and faster, making sure you're continuously communicating that long-term vision of zero trust. It's not just being transparent, it's continuously reinforcing the why behind it over and over again. Without doing that, folks may not be familiar. They become detached. As there's turnover in organizations, you can't always assume that folks coming in and joining your organization or moving departments know what zero trust is and how to execute on it. And lastly, make sure we're always putting into top of mind routine and regular objective reviews and keeping honest with how we're making forward progress. And then lastly, with behavioral nudges, you can help secure your behaviors and actions, right? Small nudges can encourage secure behaviors in line with zero trust. So for example, sending something as simple as reminders about best practices or about why we're changing what we're changing, setting up friendly prompts for multi-factor authentication, not talking about how we're going to overhaul how you log into a system or a database, not talking about the mechanics of it, but more simply talking about nudges that can make activities rewarding, such as we're going to use a one-click passwordless option to get you into your systems, and we're going to try to eliminate the complexities from you going through the process of maintaining several passwords. I mean, focusing on the positives, the benefits, default security settings as a nudge, using framing techniques to shift your perception. Again, framing is a very powerful influencing activity where you need to emphasize the positive impacts, not just from a technical and security perspective, but it's a shared responsibility to empower a safer and quicker place, a quicker action place to work. So key takeaways, something that we need to keep in mind is how we've been communicating doesn't work. Just because the information security team recognizes that zero trust is how we should be operating a program under, those principles should be guiding how we design and implement controls. That doesn't mean that we're doing an effective job of communicating the why and the benefits to the rest of the organization. So keep in mind, short backgrounds, quick nuggets, identify biggest benefits. I articulate that you've made a consideration list of who may be impacted, but also identify how you're going to maintain and check in and go forward with alignment. Also talk about where I believe we need to go, or use less inflammatory language and use a lot of storytelling to help bring folks along. We also need to talk about the benefits and the facts, whether that's improving customer or internal employee experience, how we're enabling access to data and leveling up compliance in a more simplified manner. Again, talking about operational expenses, EBITDA, net profitability, and everything in between. Get very familiar with speaking to other parts of the business. And lastly, always embracing evangelism, transparency, security, and privacy by design. All of those buzzwords help folks understand what they mean, but in their language and why they should care. All of these nuggets and tidbits, all the way from understanding and recognizing what biases exist through actually overcoming them, is going to enable you to succeed in adopting zero trust and taking a different approach other than just the technical excellence and aspects of it. So as we conclude, I invite any of you out there to follow up with questions, additional topics of conversation. You can always reach out to me through the link here. You can reach out to the folks at the Cloud Security Alliance, check out all of their materials, and don't give up. Just continue to be resistant. Use positive grit and positive perseverance to embark on your zero trust journey. And do not worry about failing initially. It's all about how you frame and bring folks along. So thank you very much. I appreciate you attending my session.